What happens when a seasoned hiker's encounter with a racist stranger in the unforgiving wilderness turns into a dramatic test of survival, skill, and the unexpected power of compassion? The crisp mountain air bit at Aisha's cheeks, a welcome sting against the rising sun. She adjusted the straps of her backpack, the weight familiar and comforting. This wasn't her first solo trek into the rugged heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains, but this particular trail, the Serpent Spine, was notorious. Locals whispered tales of its treacherous cliffs, unpredictable weather, and the unforgiving wilderness that swallowed the unprepared whole. Aisha, however, wasn't unprepared. Years of experience had honed her skills, transforming her into a creature of the wild, as comfortable navigating rocky slopes as she was navigating city streets. Her boots crunched on the gravel path, the only sound besides the chirping of unseen birds and the whisper of wind through the pines. The trailhead was already far behind, swallowed by the encroaching forest. Towering pines, their needles a deep emerald green, formed a cathedral of shadows, dappling the path in shifting light and shade. The air, still cool from the night, carried the scent of damp earth and pine needles, a fragrance both earthy and invigorating. Aisha breathed it in deeply, the familiar scent a grounding force. She checked her compass, a practiced movement, her gaze sweeping across the landscape. The Serpent Spine lived up to its name. The trail snaked its way upwards, a seemingly endless ascent that tested both stamina and resolve. She was prepared for the challenge. Her pack held everything she needed: high-energy bars, purified water, a first-aid kit, a satellite phone, and a map meticulously marked with planned routes and emergency exits. She had studied the terrain for weeks, poring over topographic maps and weather forecasts, leaving nothing to chance. The ascent grew steeper, the path becoming less defined, a mere suggestion of a trail through the dense undergrowth. Aisha moved with a fluid grace, her movements economical and precise. She navigated fallen logs and slippery rocks with ease, her boots finding purchase on the uneven terrain. She was a dancer in the wilderness, her body a symphony of controlled movement. The forest floor was a tapestry of green and brown, a carpet of moss, ferns, and decaying leaves. Sunlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy, casting the trail in a perpetual twilight. The air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying vegetation, a smell that many found unpleasant. But to Aisha, it was the comforting aroma of home. She paused to take a drink from her water bottle, the cool liquid a welcome relief against the exertion. She gazed out at the vista that unfolded before her. Far below, the world stretched out like a crumpled map, a patchwork of green valleys and distant mountains, shrouded in a hazy mist. The view was breathtaking, a reward for the arduous climb. But Aisha knew that beauty could be deceptive in these mountains. The seemingly serene landscape held the potential for danger, a stark reminder of the wild's unpredictable nature. She continued her ascent, her pace steady and deliberate. The silence of the forest was broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a hawk. She was alone, completely alone. Yet she felt a sense of profound connection to the wilderness, a feeling of belonging that she rarely experienced in the bustling city she called home. This solitude was not loneliness. It was a communion with nature, a chance to shed the layers of civilization and connect with something primal and essential. The mountains were her sanctuary, a place where she could test her limits and find a sense of peace that eluded her in the world outside. And today, she was ready to conquer the Serpent Spine. Rounding a sharp bend in the trail, Aisha came face to face with another hiker. He was a white man, middle-aged, with a paunch straining against a faded hiking shirt and cargo shorts. His face, reddened from the sun and exertion, was etched with a mixture of annoyance and something else, contempt. He leaned heavily on a walking stick, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't look prepared for this trail. His backpack was small and seemed understocked. His boots were worn and dusty. Aisha offered a polite nod, a customary greeting among hikers. She expected a similar acknowledgement, a simple nod or a murmured hello. Instead, the man stared at her, his gaze lingering on her face, her clothes, her pack, assessing her, judging her. His expression was a mixture of disbelief and disdain. "Well, well," he finally said, his voice laced with a condescending tone that grated on Aisha's nerves. "Look what the cat dragged in." Aisha's eyebrows rose slightly. She chose to ignore the offensive remark, focusing instead on the man's obvious distress. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice even and calm. "You look a little winded." He scoffed, a sound that seemed to emanate from deep within his chest. "Winded? I'm just taking a breather. This trail is a bit challenging." He paused, his eyes lingering on her well-worn hiking boots and the sturdy backpack strapped to her back. "For some people," he added, the implication clear. Aisha remained calm, her patience wearing thin. "I've hiked this trail before," she said, her tone neutral but firm. "It's certainly demanding, but manageable with proper preparation." His eyes narrowed. "Oh, you have? And I suppose you've conquered Everest too, then?" His words dripped with sarcasm, and the undercurrent of racism was unmistakable. He was belittling her, dismissing her capabilities based solely on her race. Aisha felt a surge of anger, but she tamped it down. She wasn't here to engage in a pointless argument. She was here to hike. "I'm not here to boast about my accomplishments," she responded, her voice still level. "But I am prepared for this hike. Perhaps you could use some assistance?" She gestured towards his small, inadequate backpack. He waved her off dismissively. "I'll fine. I just need a moment." He paused, then added, with a sneer, "I wouldn't expect someone like you to understand the challenges of this trail. It's not exactly your kind of thing, is it?" The blatant racism in his words was a slap in the face. Aisha had encountered subtle prejudice before, but this was blatant, unapologetic. She considered walking away, leaving him to his own devices, but something in his strained breathing, his pale face, and the way he leaned heavily on his walking stick told her that he was in trouble. She decided to give him one more chance. "I have extra water," she offered, holding up her water bottle. "And some energy bars. Would you like some?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and resentment. "No, thank you," he snapped. "I don't need your charity." He turned away, his back to her, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion and a simmering anger that was almost palpable. His refusal wasn't just a rejection of her offer. It was a rejection of her very presence. He didn't want her help. He didn't want anything to do with her. Aisha sighed, a silent acknowledgement of his prejudice, and continued on her way, leaving him alone with his arrogance and his dwindling resources. The encounter left a bitter taste in her mouth, a stark reminder that even in the solitude of the wilderness, prejudice could still find a way to intrude. Aisha continued her hike, the memory of the man's condescending words lingering in her mind. She tried to dismiss it, to focus on the beauty of the trail, but the encounter had left a knot of tension in her stomach. The further she hiked, the more she realized she was losing the trail. The well-defined path had vanished, replaced by a confusing tangle of undergrowth and fallen branches. She consulted her map, but the terrain didn't quite match the cartography. She was slightly off course. She decided to retrace her steps, hoping to find a better marker. As she backtracked, she spotted the man again, still sitting in the same spot, his face even paler than before. He seemed even more distressed, his breathing more labored. Aisha hesitated for a moment, her anger battling with her sense of compassion. He had been rude, dismissive, and frankly, racist, but she couldn't simply leave him to suffer. Approaching him cautiously, she said, "Excuse me, I believe I'm a little lost. Could you possibly point me in the right direction?" He didn't look up, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Lost, are you?" he mumbled, his voice raspy. "I'm not surprised. This trail isn't for everyone." Aisha ignored the snide remark. "I'm having trouble locating a specific marker on my map. Could you perhaps help me?" He finally looked up, his eyes narrowed. "What makes you think I'd know anything about this trail?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "I'm just a simple hiker, unlike some people who seem to think they're experts." Aisha felt her patience fraying. "I was simply asking for assistance," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "I'm not questioning your expertise. I'm asking for help." He chuckled, a harsh, grating sound. "Help? From you? You're probably just as lost as I am. Maybe you should stick to trails more suitable for your abilities. His words were laced with a venom that left no room for misinterpretation. He was openly mocking her, making it clear that he considered her incapable of navigating the trail, simply because of her race. Aisha's anger flared. She wanted to walk away, to leave him to his own misery, but the sight of his distress, his obvious struggle, held her back. "I'm asking for directions," she said, her voice steady despite the rising anger. "And while I'm at it, I'm also asking for some water. I've been hiking for hours, and my water supply is running low." He shook his head, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Water? You think I'm going to share my water with you? You're probably just going to waste it. Besides," he added, his voice laced with contempt, "I doubt you even know how to properly use a map." His words stung, but Aisha refused to let him see her anger. She maintained her composure, her voice calm and measured. "I'm not asking for a handout," she said. "I'm asking for help. I'm offering to share my supplies if you need it. But if you refuse, then I'll simply find my way on my own." She turned to leave, her back stiff with a mixture of anger and disappointment. His blatant racism and refusal of help were a stark reminder of the prejudice she still faced, even in the isolated beauty of the wilderness. But she wouldn't let it break her. She would find her way, regardless of his hateful words. Aisha walked away, her resolve hardening with each step. She wouldn't let Mark's prejudice derail her hike. She was determined to prove to herself, and perhaps to him, that his assumptions were wrong. She spent several minutes carefully studying her map and the surrounding terrain, comparing the contours of the land with the lines on the paper. She noticed a small, almost imperceptible change in the vegetation, a subtle shift in the types of plants and the density of the undergrowth that indicated a change in the elevation and the direction of the trail. Using her compass and her knowledge of the local flora, she identified a barely visible trail, barely more than a deer path, that veered off to the left. It wasn't marked on her map, but her experience told her it was the correct route. She had learned to read the subtle signs of the wilderness, to interpret the language of the land. It was a skill that came from years of hiking, from countless hours spent immersed in the natural world. She moved confidently along the new path, her movements fluid and efficient. She navigated the dense undergrowth with ease, her boots finding purchase on the uneven ground. She used her walking stick to probe the ground ahead, checking for loose rocks and hidden obstacles. She was a creature of the wilderness, at home in this rugged terrain. As she climbed, she noticed small details that would have escaped the untrained eye. The way the sunlight filtered through the trees, the subtle changes in the slope of the land, the patterns of the moss on the rocks. All these details spoke to her, guiding her along the correct path. She knew the signs of approaching weather changes, the subtle shift in the wind, the way the clouds gathered on the horizon. She was aware of her surroundings, acutely attuned to the rhythms of the natural world. She paused to take a drink of water, savoring the cool liquid. She checked her supplies, making sure she had enough food and water for the rest of the hike. She meticulously cleaned a small cut on her hand, applying antiseptic and a bandage. She was prepared for anything, anticipating potential challenges and taking preventative measures. This wasn't just a hike. It was a demonstration of her skills, a testament to her expertise. She continued her ascent, her pace steady and deliberate. The trail was challenging, but she navigated it with ease, her movements a testament to her years of experience. She passed several small streams, carefully choosing her path to avoid getting her boots wet. She identified several edible plants, noting their location for future reference. She observed the behavior of the local wildlife, noting the tracks of deer and the calls of birds. She was not just hiking. She was studying, learning, and connecting with the natural world on a deeper level. She reached a point where the trail opened up, revealing a breathtaking vista. Below her, the valley stretched out, a tapestry of green and brown, dotted with the occasional farmhouse. In the distance, mountains rose like ancient sentinels, their peaks shrouded in mist. It was a scene of unparalleled beauty, a reward for her perseverance and her skills. She took a moment to appreciate the view, to breathe in the crisp mountain air, and to feel the satisfaction of having successfully navigated a challenging section of the trail. She continued her hike, leaving Mark behind, his arrogance and prejudice fading into the distance. She was alone, but she wasn't lonely. She was surrounded by the beauty and the challenge of the wilderness, and she was more than capable of handling both. She was a hiker, a survivor, a woman of the mountains, and she would complete her hike, not just for herself, but as a silent rebuke to the ignorance and prejudice she had encountered. Her journey was a testament to her strength, her resilience, and her unwavering spirit. Mark watched Aisha disappear into the dense undergrowth, a mixture of resentment and grudging admiration swirling within him. He dismissed her, underestimated her, and now he was paying the price for his arrogance. His initial confidence had been a fragile facade, masking his lack of preparation and experience. He hadn't studied the trail, hadn't checked the weather forecast, and his supplies were woefully inadequate. He'd relied on his perceived superiority, his assumption that his inherent privilege would somehow protect him from the dangers of the wilderness. He tried to follow the trail Aisha had taken, but he quickly lost it. His worn boots slipped on loose rocks, and he stumbled several times, his already dwindling energy further depleted. He lacked Aisha's sure-footedness, her intuitive understanding of the terrain. He lacked her experience. He'd scoffed at her preparedness, but now he was acutely aware of his own shortcomings. His arrogance, which had fueled his earlier disdain for Aisha, now blinded him to the growing dangers. He ignored the subtle signs of an approaching storm, the darkening sky, the shift in the wind, the distant rumble of thunder. He pressed on, driven by a stubborn refusal to admit he was wrong, a refusal to acknowledge his own limitations. He made a series of poor decisions, each one leading him further astray. He ignored a well-marked trail that veered to the right, choosing instead to follow a less defined path that seemed to offer a shortcut. It was a classic mistake, born of impatience and overconfidence. He underestimated the difficulty of the terrain, failing to recognize the subtle changes in elevation and the hidden obstacles concealed by the dense undergrowth. He pushed himself beyond his limits, ignoring the warning signs of exhaustion and dehydration. His breathing grew labored, his muscles ached, and his vision blurred. He was running out of water, and his energy bars were almost gone. He was unprepared for the harsh realities of the wilderness, unprepared for the consequences of his own hubris. The storm broke as he struggled to climb a particularly steep and rocky section of the trail. The rain came down in sheets, soaking him to the bone. The wind howled, whipping through the trees, and the thunder roared, shaking the ground beneath his feet. He was completely exposed, vulnerable to the elements. His arrogance had left him unprepared for the sudden shift in weather, and now he was paying the price. He slipped on a wet rock, falling heavily to the ground. He felt a sharp pain in his ankle, and he knew immediately that he was injured. The storm raged around him, and he was alone, lost, injured, and utterly defeated. His overconfidence, his prejudice, and his lack of preparation had all conspired to bring him to this point. He was paying the price for his arrogance, for his dismissal of Aisha's expertise, for his refusal to acknowledge his own limitations. He was trapped, and he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was in serious trouble. His earlier disdain for Aisha was replaced by a desperate hope that someone, somehow, would find him before it was too late. His pride had been shattered, replaced by a desperate need for help. The storm raged on, a relentless assault on Mark's already fragile state. The rain hammered down, turning the trail into a muddy, treacherous obstacle course. Each step was agony, his injured ankle throbbing with every movement. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at his clothes and whipping his hair across his face. He tried to find shelter, but the dense forest offered little protection from the storm's fury. His initial panic gave way to a chilling sense of isolation. He was utterly alone, surrounded by a hostile and unforgiving wilderness. The familiar landmarks he'd relied on earlier had vanished, swallowed by the relentless rain and the swirling mist. The trail, already indistinct, had completely disappeared, replaced by a confusing maze of tangled undergrowth and slippery rocks. He tried to use his compass, but the rain had rendered it useless. His phone, of course, had no signal. He was completely lost, adrift in a sea of green, with no sense of direction and no hope of rescue. The arrogance that had fueled his earlier dismissal of Aisha's expertise had completely evaporated, replaced by a gnawing fear that was slowly consuming him. He stumbled onward, driven by a desperate need to find his way out, a need that was slowly being eroded by exhaustion and despair. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous, the path becoming a series of steep climbs and perilous descents. He slipped and fell repeatedly, his injured ankle screaming in protest. He was running out of energy, his body racked with pain and exhaustion. The darkness deepened, the storm showing no signs of abating. The forest, once a source of beauty and challenge, had transformed into a menacing labyrinth, a place of fear and uncertainty. The trees loomed like menacing figures, their branches twisting and contorting in the wind. The sounds of the storm, the howling wind, the crashing thunder, the relentless rain, filled him with a sense of dread. He tried to build a makeshift shelter, but his injured ankle and dwindling energy made the task almost impossible. He huddled beneath a large rock, seeking meager protection from the storm's fury. The cold seeped into his bones, and his teeth chattered uncontrollably. He was shivering uncontrollably, his body racked with pain and exhaustion. His earlier confidence, his smug dismissal of Aisha's skills, seemed like a distant memory, a cruel joke played on him by his own arrogance. He was utterly alone, lost and injured in the heart of the wilderness, his fate hanging precariously in the balance. The storm raged on, a relentless symbol of his own internal turmoil, a reflection of the chaos and despair that had overtaken him. His body ached, his spirit was broken, and his only hope was a faint, almost imperceptible glimmer of a chance that someone might find him before the wilderness claimed him completely. His earlier disdain for Aisha, his blatant racism, seemed impossibly distant now, replaced by a desperate longing for rescue, a desperate hope that someone, somehow, would find him before it was too late. His arrogance had brought him to this point, and now he was paying the ultimate price. The storm finally began to subside, but the darkness remained, a heavy blanket that smothered the forest in an oppressive silence. Mark's shivering had lessened, replaced by a bone-deep chill that seeped into his very core. His injured ankle throbbed with a relentless pain that radiated up his leg, making even the slightest movement excruciating. He tried to shift his position, to find a more comfortable spot beneath the rock, but a sharp, searing pain shot through his leg, making him cry out in agony. He had twisted his ankle badly, far worse than he initially thought. He felt a sickening crunch as he moved it, and a wave of nausea washed over him. He knew, with a sickening certainty, that he had seriously injured himself. The pain was intense, a searing agony that made him gasp for breath. He tried to stand, to assess the damage, but the pain was too intense, forcing him back down to the cold, damp ground. He was trapped. He couldn't walk, couldn't even crawl. He was completely immobile, stranded in the middle of nowhere, his injuries worsening with each passing moment. The storm had passed, but a new kind of storm raged within him, a storm of fear, despair, and regret. He realized the gravity of his situation. He was alone, injured, and completely vulnerable. His earlier arrogance, his dismissal of Aisha's expertise, his blatant racism, all of it seemed incredibly foolish now, a cruel joke played on him by his own hubris. He had underestimated the wilderness, underestimated his own limitations, and now he was paying the ultimate price. He tried to call for help, but his voice was weak, barely a whisper lost in the vastness of the forest. He had no signal on his phone, and even if he did, he doubted anyone would be able to find him in this remote location. He was utterly alone, completely at the mercy of the wilderness. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the pain, the cold, and the creeping despair. He thought of his family, his friends, the life he had taken for granted. He thought of Aisha, her confident stride, her quiet competence, her unwavering strength. He had judged her, dismissed her, and now he was desperately hoping for her help, a help he had so arrogantly refused. His earlier prejudice seemed ludicrous now, a stark contrast to the desperate need for assistance that consumed him. He had judged her based on her race, ignoring her skills and experience. He had been blinded by his own arrogance, his own sense of entitlement. Now he was paying the price for his ignorance, for his prejudice, for his hubris. He lay there, alone and injured, the cold seeping into his bones, the pain consuming his body, and the despair crushing his spirit. He had underestimated the power of the wilderness, the power of nature, and the power of human compassion. He had been wrong, profoundly wrong, and now he was left to face the consequences of his actions, alone and vulnerable in the unforgiving heart of the wilderness. His only hope was that someone, somehow, would find him before it was too late. His only hope was a miracle. Aisha continued her hike, the beauty of the landscape a stark contrast to the bitterness left by her encounter with Mark. She pushed the memory of his hateful words aside, focusing on the trail ahead. But as she progressed, a nagging feeling of unease settled in her gut. She had noticed Mark's distress earlier, his obvious lack of preparation, his strained breathing. And now, hours later, he was nowhere to be seen. She stopped to consult her map, retracing her steps mentally. She hadn't seen him since their last encounter, and the trail hadn't offered any other meeting points. A sense of unease, a prickling at the back of her neck, told her something was wrong. It wasn't just the absence of Mark. It was a deeper, more primal sense of foreboding. The wilderness had a way of communicating its secrets to those who knew how to listen, and Aisha was a keen listener. She paused, considering her options. She could continue her hike, pushing the unease aside and focusing on her own journey. But something held her back, a sense of responsibility, a feeling that she couldn't simply ignore the possibility that Mark was in trouble. His arrogance and prejudice had been unforgivable, but his distress had been undeniable. She decided to search for him. It wasn't a decision she took lightly. It meant deviating from her planned route, potentially jeopardizing her own safety and the completion of her hike. But the thought of leaving him to his fate, alone and potentially injured in the unforgiving wilderness, was unbearable. Her sense of compassion, her inherent empathy, outweighed her anger and frustration. She retraced her steps, carefully examining the trail for any signs of Mark's passage. She looked for broken branches, disturbed leaves, footprints in the mud, any indication of his whereabouts. Her keen eyes scanned the forest floor, searching for clues that would lead her to him. She used her experience, her knowledge of the wilderness, to guide her search. She moved slowly, methodically, her senses heightened, her attention focused on every detail. She listened for any sounds that might betray his presence, a cry for help, a groan of pain, the rustling of leaves. She was a hunter, tracking her prey, but her prey was not an animal. It was a man who had treated her with contempt, but a man who was now in desperate need of help. The forest was silent, save for the whisper of the wind through the trees and the distant call of a bird. The silence, however, was not peaceful. It was heavy with tension, with the unspoken weight of Mark's potential distress. Aisha pressed on, her determination fueled by a mixture of concern and a quiet sense of purpose. She knew the wilderness. She knew its dangers, its secrets, its potential for both beauty and brutality. And she was prepared to face whatever it held, to find Mark, and to offer him the help he so desperately needed. She was not just a hiker. She was a rescuer, guided by her compassion and her unwavering commitment to human life. Following a faint trail of broken branches and disturbed undergrowth, Aisha eventually came to a small clearing. The ground was muddy and churned, evidence of a recent struggle. She spotted a discarded walking stick, its tip broken, lying near a large rock. Her heart pounded in her chest as she recognized the stick as belonging to Mark. She moved cautiously, her senses on high alert. She called out his name, her voice a low whisper that carried through the stillness of the forest. There was no response. She continued her search, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of him. She found him huddled beneath the rock, his body soaked and shivering, his face pale and drawn. He was lying on the ground, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle, his breathing shallow and labored. He looked utterly defeated, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and despair. The sight of him, so vulnerable and helpless, stirred a complex mix of emotions within Aisha: anger at his earlier behavior, compassion for his current distress, and a quiet sense of satisfaction at her ability to find him. She approached him slowly, kneeling beside him. "Mark," she said softly, her voice gentle but firm. "Are you all right?" He looked up, his eyes widening in surprise, then relief. "Aisha," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's you." "Yes, it's me," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "What happened?" He explained his misfortunes, his voice filled with a mixture of shame and desperation. He confessed his poor judgment, his lack of preparation, his arrogance. He admitted his earlier disdain for her, his blatant racism, now replaced by a desperate plea for help. His voice cracked with emotion, his words a mixture of apology and self-recrimination. Aisha listened patiently, her anger gradually giving way to compassion. She examined his injuries, noting the severity of his ankle and the numerous scrapes and bruises covering his body. She knew he needed immediate medical attention, but they were miles from civilization, and help was hours away. Using her extensive wilderness skills, she began to assess the situation. She carefully examined his ankle, determining the extent of the damage. She knew it was badly sprained, possibly broken. She gently cleaned and bandaged his wounds, applying antiseptic and pain relievers from her first aid kit. She used her knowledge of herbal remedies to create a poultice to reduce swelling and inflammation. She carefully splinted his injured leg using branches and strips of cloth from her backpack. She knew that transporting him would be difficult, but she was determined to get him to safety. She built a makeshift stretcher using branches and her backpack straps. She carefully lifted him onto the stretcher, supporting his weight as she prepared to carry him out of the wilderness. She knew the journey would be long and arduous, but she was determined to get him to safety. She was fueled by a combination of compassion, skill, and a quiet sense of justice. She had found him, and now she would save him. Her earlier anger at his prejudice had been replaced by a quiet determination to help him, not just because he was in need, but because it was the right thing to do. Her actions were a testament to her character, her skills, and her unwavering belief in the power of human compassion. The journey out was slow and arduous. Aisha, despite her strength and experience, struggled with the weight of Mark and the uneven terrain. The forest floor was a treacherous mix of mud, rocks, and tangled undergrowth. She had to carefully navigate fallen logs, slippery rocks, and dense thickets, all while supporting Mark's considerable weight on the makeshift stretcher. She paused frequently to rest, to adjust the stretcher, and to check on Mark's condition. Mark, humbled by his situation and Aisha's unwavering care, offered little resistance. His earlier arrogance had been completely replaced by a deep sense of shame and gratitude. He watched in quiet amazement as Aisha, despite his earlier treatment of her, worked tirelessly to get him to safety. Her skills were evident in her every movement, her expertise undeniable. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her actions precise and deliberate, a stark contrast to his own clumsy and ill-prepared efforts. She showed him the same compassion he had so cruelly denied her. She spoke to him gently, offering words of encouragement and reassurance. She checked his condition regularly, attending to his injuries with a skill and care that far surpassed anything he could have imagined. She even shared her remaining food and water with him, despite his earlier refusal of her offer. As they moved, Aisha shared her knowledge of the wilderness, pointing out edible plants, identifying animal tracks, and explaining the subtle signs of the changing weather. She spoke of her love for the mountains, her respect for their power and beauty, and her deep understanding of their unpredictable nature. She spoke of her passion for hiking, her dedication to preparedness, and her unwavering belief in the importance of respecting the wilderness and its inherent dangers. Mark listened intently, his earlier prejudice slowly dissolving in the face of her unwavering kindness and expertise. He had judged her based on her race, dismissing her abilities and her experience. He had been blinded by his own arrogance, his own sense of entitlement. Now, he saw her for who she truly was, a skilled hiker, a compassionate human being, and a woman of remarkable strength and resilience. He watched as she navigated the difficult terrain, her movements fluid and graceful, her determination unwavering. He saw the depth of her knowledge, the breadth of her skills, and the unwavering commitment to her task. He had underestimated her, and he was profoundly ashamed of his own ignorance and prejudice. As they finally emerged from the forest, the sight of civilization, a distant road, a faint glimmer of light, filled both of them with relief. They had made it. They were safe. Mark felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for his rescue, but for the lesson he had learned. He had been wrong, profoundly wrong, and he would never forget the experience, the humbling lesson, and the unexpected compassion he had received from the woman he had so carelessly judged. He had been saved by the very person he had underestimated, a testament to the power of compassion and the limitations of prejudice. A rescue vehicle arrived, summoned by Aisha's satellite phone. Paramedics assessed Mark's injuries, confirming a badly sprained ankle and several minor abrasions. They stabilized his leg and prepared to transport him to the nearest hospital. As they prepared to leave, Mark looked at Aisha, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and gratitude. "Aisha," he began, his voice thick with emotion, I owe you my life." Aisha nodded, her expression calm but firm. "You do," she replied, her voice even and measured. "But what you owe me more than anything is an apology." Mark looked down, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I know," he said quietly. "I was wrong. I was arrogant, ignorant, and prejudiced. I judged you based on your race, dismissing your skills and your experience. I was a fool." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "I'm truly sorry," he said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I behaved abominably. My prejudice blinded me to your competence, your kindness, your strength. I was wrong to underestimate you, to dismiss you, to treat you with such disrespect." Aisha nodded, accepting his apology. "I accept your apology," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But an apology isn't enough. You need to understand why your actions were wrong, and you need to make a conscious effort to change your behavior." Mark nodded, his eyes filled with remorse. "I understand," he said. "This experience has been a profound wake-up call. I've seen the error of my ways, the danger of my prejudice. I will never again judge someone based on their race or any other superficial characteristic. I will strive to be a better person, a more compassionate person, a more understanding person." He paused, his voice trembling slightly. "You showed me compassion when I showed you nothing but contempt. You saved my life when I treated you with disdain. You are a remarkable woman, Aisha, and I am deeply ashamed of how I treated you." Aisha nodded, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over her. "I hope this experience will teach you a valuable lesson," she said. "Prejudice is a dangerous thing, Mark. It blinds us to the truth. It prevents us from seeing the inherent worth of others, and it can have devastating consequences." Mark nodded solemnly, his face etched with remorse. "I understand," he said. "I will never forget this experience. It has changed me, and I am grateful for that. Thank you, Aisha. Thank you for saving my life, and thank you for teaching me a lesson I will never forget." As the paramedics helped him into the ambulance, Mark looked back at Aisha, his eyes filled with gratitude and a newfound respect. He knew he had a long way to go, but he was committed to confronting his prejudices and becoming a better person. The wilderness had been his teacher, and Aisha, despite his earlier treatment of her, had been his savior. The experience had been humbling, painful, and ultimately transformative. He would never forget the lesson he had learned, the price he had paid for his arrogance, and the unexpected compassion he had received from the woman he had so carelessly underestimated. Aisha watched the ambulance disappear down the mountain road, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her. She had completed her rescue mission, but the experience had left its mark. She had faced prejudice head-on, and she had emerged victorious, not just in saving Mark's life, but in demonstrating the power of compassion and the limitations of hatred. She continued her hike, her pace slower now, her thoughts contemplative. The mountains, once a sanctuary of solitude, now felt different, imbued with a new layer of meaning. The experience with Mark had been a stark reminder of the pervasiveness of prejudice, even in the most unexpected places. It had also been a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the power of compassion, and the transformative potential of a humbling experience. She reached a high point overlooking the valley, the sun setting, casting long shadows across the landscape. The view was breathtaking, but her gaze was inward, reflecting on the events of the past few days. She thought of Mark, his initial arrogance, his blatant racism, and his subsequent remorse and gratitude. She thought of his transformation, his acknowledgement of his own failings, and his commitment to personal growth. She had expected anger, resentment, perhaps even a desire for revenge. Instead, she had found an opportunity for education, a chance to challenge prejudice, and a demonstration of the power of compassion. She had saved a man's life, not just physically, but spiritually, helping him confront his own biases and embark on a journey of self-improvement. Her own journey, too, had been transformed. She had faced prejudice head-on, and she had emerged stronger, more resilient, and more committed to her values. The experience had reaffirmed her belief in the power of human connection, the importance of empathy, and the transformative potential of unexpected encounters. She continued her hike, completing the Serpent's Spine Trail, her steps now imbued with a newfound sense of purpose. The mountains remained her sanctuary, a place of solitude and reflection, but they were also a reminder of the complexities of human nature, the pervasiveness of prejudice, and the transformative power of compassion. She thought of Mark, hoping that his commitment to change would endure, that his experience would serve as a catalyst for personal growth and a reevaluation of his beliefs. She knew that prejudice was a deep-seated problem, but she also knew that it could be challenged, confronted, and ultimately overcome. Her encounter with Mark had been a powerful reminder of that truth. As she descended the mountain, the setting sun casting a warm glow on the landscape, Aisha felt a profound sense of peace. She had faced a challenge, overcome an obstacle, and emerged stronger and more committed to her values. She had saved a life, and in doing so, she had saved a part of herself. The wilderness had tested her, but it had also strengthened her, reaffirming her belief in the power of compassion, the resilience of the human spirit, and the transformative potential of unexpected encounters. Her journey was far from over, but she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with her skills, her compassion, and her unwavering belief in the power of human connection.